Hello and welcome to A Week in My Flexible Working Life, sponsored by Condeco, workspace solutions for the future at work. I'm your host, Juliet Mann. Each episode, I'll speak with business leaders and influencers about how their workplace is changing and what the future of work could look like for us all. My guest today is UK Youth CEO Ndidi Okezie. Ndidi is a change maker, a youth work charity boss and former teacher. She's also spent 6 years as the executive director of Teach First and led digital and customer voice strategy for Pearson plc. She's a board trustee for the youth homelessness charity Centrepoint, the Mulberry Schools Trust and the National Citizen Service. And if that's not enough, she also has an OBE for services to young people. Ndidi, welcome. Oh my goodness, you've been busy.
Hi, Juliet. Thank you so much for having me.
We are delighted to have you. What I want to know, though, is what got you started?
It's funny, I think, life always makes sense in hindsight, right? Like in reverse, it all seamlessly threads through. For me, the key catalyst was making the decision to join the teacher training program, Teach First. I was freshly out of university. I was working in the magazine publishing industry. It was, what I thought I wanted, a city job, all that kind of glitz and glamour. I just wasn't fulfilled. It wasn't really making me jump out of bed in the morning. And I realized really quickly that that was something that was important to me.
What, the glitz and glamour or the jumping out of bed?
The jumping out of bed. Definitely realised the glitz and glamour is not me. But just the idea, I'd never thought about that. I'd never thought about fulfilment. I'd never really thought about the notion that you should do something that fuels you. As soon as that thought cemented, I realised, that makes total sense. That's who I am. That's how my childhood's been. So discovering something where I could pour that energy into, I think really set me on the path to always do work that sets your soul on fire, as it were. So that's, for me, I think the definite catalyst for where I am now.
You say sets your soul on fire. I mean, a lot of people out there in the jobs market, particularly now after, the rocky pandemic, furlough and all of these things, they might be thinking, gosh, I just want a job. I want to feel valued. I want to earn a living. Whether it makes me feel fabulous or whether it is my calling might come second place.
I think a way around that is interesting. So often people think that there's a particular type of work or a typical level or something where all of that clicks in. I think it's all about intentionality. I think it's about being clear why you're doing what you're doing at a given moment. I'm a real big fan of Simon Sinek and the question of why. And I think there's always got to be a bigger why than the logistics of the job you're doing, because it doesn't matter. Every job has parts of it that you would rather not do, right? Like, I'm a CEO. I don't love every part of my job, but the why is bigger, and it's big enough that it allows me to accommodate the things that I'm not so much of a fan of, and allows me to understand that I'm actually pursuing something bigger. So I think at whatever stage you are, understanding, okay, what is it that I want to get out of this moment? What are the skills that I'm building? What's the thinking that I want to develop? What's my opportunity to learn? And you know what? It might even just be the discipline of doing something repetitively. Like, that in itself is a skill that you are going to lean on for, many decades to come. So I guess I just would say to people, don't ever underestimate the stages you are at. Every single stage is a building block to the future, 100%.
When you dived into Teach First and retrained, did you ever think that you'd end up where you are now? You then pivoted again and took that a stage further.
Yeah, and I think for me, even the thing about the Teach First program, we were the inaugural year. This is back in 2003. And so there was no legacy of what this is. We had no idea Teach First would become what Teach First became. It was the mandate of change that I was drawn to. So it was this movement that wanted to address educational inequality, was, saying that as a society, we can do better. And as somebody who'd experienced lots of different things growing up and through my education, that just resonated with me. And so I wanted to be part of something that was about changing communities, changing one life for the better, let alone changing systems. And actually, in doing Teach First, I accepted a part of the program that I didn't think I would like. The worst part of the Teach First offer was the teaching part. You couldn't have told me that teaching would be something I would ever entertain myself doing. It was on the cons list, you know, when you draw a pros and cons list of doing something. The idea that I would have to teach was on, you know, squarely.
But that's kind of what it says on the tin.
Exactly. But they said only for 2 years, right? So they said, you know, the minimum you have to do is just come and join this work, join this effort. You're needed. And, you know, you just have to do it for 2 years. And after 2 years, you can decide what you want to do. And that was genius, because that was the reason I did it. And I had no idea 2 years would turn into 10 years. I had no idea I would fall in love with teaching. I had no idea that this would be the path that I would then follow forever. You say the pivot, but for me, the golden thread has always been about making lives of the generations coming up behind me better. There's a real sense of accountability and responsibility. I feel that my job is to ensure that my generation makes life better for the generations coming behind us, because I think I benefit from those that came before me, right? I couldn't be a CEO talking to you, all these kind of platforms, if the generations ahead of me hadn't done what they did. And so I think we all have that pay it forward responsibility. And so with all the jobs that I've done, you'll see that young people are squarely at the heart. I've gone to different parts of the work because I'm very fascinated by systems change. And so for me, in order to understand that, I think you have to understand the various components of the system. And that's what I've been quite intentional about getting experience in.
You talk about systems change, and I'm wondering if a key ingredient to that, when you're talking to the next generation and when you're trying to pay it forward, is being brave. You said yourself that you were the inaugural year of the programme you took part in. There was no track record. You were taking a risk. But on the other hand, so much of how we're traditionally taught is go to school, get your qualifications, go off to college, get an internship, safe, go for a big company that has that track record. But in a way, you're saying, hang on, the future of work is going to be more about risk-taking and being brave.
I probably would have answered that question really different at different stages of my life, because I agree with you, and that 100% is me. I am drawn to the first kind of responder mentality, the kind of creator, innovator, like that is something that I really thrive in. That's an environment that it's just who I am. And so often, you know, when things are perfectly fine, you'll see me always saying, is there different things we could be doing? I'm always searching for more, but I don't think the world needs everyone like that, right? You know, my organization couldn't survive or run if every person was like me. And so I think you do need people who can take what you've said and execute it, and people who are, you know, steady the ship and, you know, all those sorts of different elements. So anyone listening, I don't think you have to be a kind of rip it all up and start again type person.
But you want one of those people as part of your team?
100%. I definitely probably want more than one, to be fair, because we work in a sector where we're trying to create change. So for me, we're not at the stage where we can be complacent. We're not at the stage where we can say, oh, well, it is what it is, because, well, what's the point?
There are moments when you've said you sit there and say things are perfectly fine, and then that gives you itchy feet and you want to start changing. Let's look at what's been happening around the country, around the world. Things haven't been very fine, particularly, some might argue, for young people.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I would say, you know, get itchy feet and things are fine is because it depends who you're asking, right? So it might be fine for the individuals that are benefiting in that moment, but it may not be fine for everybody. And the most dangerous thing that can happen is that you become complacent because the status quo works for you, but it doesn't work for everybody. And so for me, that's the reason why, you know, we would close up shop as a charity if everything was fine, right? Charities shouldn't have to exist. They exist because there's a gap, there's a flaw, there's a problem that needs to be solved. And so I think that, yeah, the reality is that we have definitely seen the pandemic exacerbate social issues, social inequalities. But to be honest, Juliet, I don't know that there are many things the pandemic has done that have created new problems. I think they've exacerbated things, but they've also revealed things to more people.
They've thrown that
Yes,
spotlight on
exactly.
them.
All of a sudden, we realize, oh, there's a thing called digital inequality. Oh, when we say, study from home and close schools and everyone work from home, we suddenly realize, well, okay, well, if you're a family with multiple children and you have one device, how are you doing that? You suddenly go from a family who has broadband, money for internet a few times a week or whatever. All of a sudden, it's every day, all day.
I remember in lockdown seeing groups of kids hanging outside closed up McDonald's, and they were pressing themselves up against the window to try and see if the Wi-Fi was still on.
100%.
I mean, look, the headlines have been screaming that young people are worried about jobs, not just now, but post-pandemic, that they're missing the office, that their prospects are dwindling. Talk to me a little bit about how you've seen employers adapt to managing young people remotely.
Yeah, I think it's a really important topic, and it's one that we're really grappling with as an organisation. And actually, I've got lots of peers in the sector who, I'm having these similar conversations with. And the way that we're thinking about it is, we were one of the organizations, as I think and I hope most were, that embraced, flexible working, embraced remote working. As an organization, I think it accelerated what I would have planned to do anyway as a CEO. You don't have to live in London to work with us, but we've accelerated that. So we definitely have people from all over the place. And you have so many people who have loved, the idea to suddenly, not have to commute and all of that. Particularly, I would say senior leadership have really enjoyed that, just, across the board, not just my organization. One of the things that we did quite recently is I only started as a CEO in January 2020. So I set off very intentionally speaking to staff on a really regular cadence. And I had town halls and little group conversations and, so something that has been quite beneficial. And so we had a recent round of those. I had town halls with people, and it was really interesting in those town halls how often this point was raised, this issue of, I've got people this is their first job out of school, out of university, or, second job, whatever. And consistently, they were worried that they would be missing out. They illuminated the issue for me in a way that I don't think I had been as conscious of. And so really probing, trying to understand, well, why? And it was really interesting. The reflections were, how do you learn how to work? How do you learn, what is work? How do I learn how to be around people? How do I learn, all of these things that you just think, of course, all of the in-between parts of work, the kind of sitting shoulder to shoulder with somebody, the listening as other people have a conversation, all of those learning moments, we've taken that away if we if we go full throttle into remote working. And they were concerned. And I just thought, wow.
So what are companies doing about that? I mean, now, of course, the economy is opening up. People are being encouraged to go back to the office. But you also mentioned this keenness to limit commutes and to have a little bit of flexibility. So how are companies getting around that challenge?
The right way, and lots of the things that I'm hearing about, is that it's real humility to say that we don't know, right? We don't know the answers, but we're 100% committed to figuring it out.
You focus on the next generation of workers, helping bring young people into the workplace. And a lot of those you're working with and you're talking about are in their first or their second job, out of college, out of school, whatever. Now, but we're hearing a lot from employers and industry heads about skills shortage. I mean, right now there are record vacancies for jobs like chef, care assistants, lorry drivers and berry pickers. Those aren't necessarily skill sets that are going to match up with the people who are looking for work. I mean, if we're talking about the future of work in terms of professions and office jobs, do you see maybe schools beginning to focus on teaching kids skills for a remote workplace?
Yeah, this kind of goes to the heart of what we do at UK Youth. And I always feel quite privileged to be able to answer this question from the lens of somebody who has spent the majority of their life working in schools, with schools, in the kind of formal education world, and has now come into the non-formal education world. And UK Youth is a hybrid organisation ourselves. So we are an infrastructure body supporting the youth sector as a whole, working with government, working with partners to support the infrastructure of the sector. But we are also a delivery partner. So we design and deliver programs that youth organisations can use to support their young people. We have over 8,000 youth organisations right across the UK with nation partners in other countries. At the heart of our new strategy is the problem, as it were, or the mandate to unlock youth work as the catalyst for change that young people need now more than ever. And for me, the reason why this is so important is questions like yours, which are so common, which are so right, which are so reflective, immediately go to the schools. And the instinct is, when I need to talk about young people and what young people need, well, obviously the place to go is schools. The problem is schools have a pretty packed agenda of things that they need to do that are not nice to haves. And I'm not saying there's not a lot of stuff to do with the curriculum that can change and evolve. I think that's totally fine. But what we are talking about in terms of what you're describing is a revolution around youth development. The only way that's going to happen is if we unlock youth work. If we get the youth work sector to be able to work in lockstep with the education sector. And so when you talk about the kind of skills that are needed, it shouldn't be an add-on to a, geography lesson or history lesson or whatever. There should be an entire experience that young people get from young all the way through that is all about developing them in terms of skills, whether it's resilience, curiosity, critical thinking, all of these things that we now suddenly realize at the point of employment is needed.
They're not nice to have. They're not nice to have. I like that expression of yours.
Absolutely. But they're not something that you can just tag on to an education system that is still struggling to deliver the basics for young people. We talked about Teach First at the very beginning. The problem Teach First was created to solve is worse now than it was before, particularly after the pandemic.
Oh dear.
We have, people leaving without literacy skills, numeracy skills. These aren't nice to haves either. So we really need to not rob Peter to pay Paul. We need to utilize the other sectors that exist that are experts in developing young people. How do all of these professions work better in a more joined up way? That's what's needed.
Indeed, sometimes I feel that when we hear about young people and remote working, there's an assumption that it's easy for them to be nimble and to adapt, that they're almost at an advantage because they grew up with the internet. But what about disadvantaged young people? You mentioned this right at the top, who might not have computers, high-speed internet, even a space to have a Zoom meeting. How can employers make sure that they're not pushing a whole demographic of young people out?
I think it's so important. And I think the only way around that is you have to get to know your people. And I think you have to you have to get out and about as an employer and really put yourself in spaces and environments where you are listening to voices that are new and different and varied. The examples you talk about, we have so many examples of young people who, again, trying to work in a corner of their bed in a room that they share with two other siblings. This is not school, this is work. They're trying to, they're doing their work on their lap, on their bed. And you're asking them to be productive, you're asking them to be effective. And in lots of instances, they're not always forthcoming to be able to just kind of share that information if the employer doesn't create a psychologically safe space where people can say, really, what is your situation at home? I actually think this is a HR requirement. I think you need to make sure that everybody has the equipment that they need, but also has the space. And this might also be, maybe it's not come to the office, but maybe there are co-work spaces or other things that you offer in terms of different localities that people can go to. But yeah, I think that it's very, very common. I would say the majority of people don't have a separate space that they can use as an office. Life is real when you're at home and trying to juggle all of those things. It's all well and good when you are seasoned and experienced in work. But for so many young people, I think it has been incredibly difficult. And then let's just be clear, most of the jobs that young people take up are not the kind of jobs you can do at home, right? And actually, that's where the economy's been pressed in a lot of ways. So retail, hospitality, all of these things, the fact that so many of those jobs have disappeared and gone online, that ripple effect is catastrophic for young people. And I think that's also something we're going to have to reconcile ourselves with.
So there's a role for schools, there's a role for employers here to rethink. So maybe I'm thinking mentorships and training. Let's talk about things like internship schemes, apprenticeships, because it feels like there are a couple of things here. The first, that a lot of older people are moving jobs or even industries, so entry-level work is perhaps more scarce. And the other thing is perhaps employers are being tempted to offer unpaid internships because they're struggling themselves, and that can be problematic for a number of reasons. So how are you working to make sure that young people have the same, if not greater, access to opportunities, but that employers can ensure their cash flow too?
We have an outdoor learning centre in the New Forest where more than almost half of our staff are based there, working, in activity centres for young people, families, communities to engage in. We have an apprenticeship programme that runs through there that we're trying to now expand into the other half of UK Youth. It's really interesting trying to make the numbers balance, right? Like, it's really interesting how you prioritize young people and their development by also still making it something that you can actually deliver as an organization. It's hard, it's difficult, but I think it's the right thing to do. And I think it's really important. And we've actually gone through the process of trying to understand how we phase strategic priorities to account for the fact that you might have people starting at the beginning of the ladder in terms of their skills development, which means sometimes you won't always be able to go as fast as you want to go, but it's the right thing to do. I love things like the Kickstart program. I think is a really important initiative, a government initiative. I think it needs to be longer than 6 months. I think the quality of those kind of programs needs to be held to a really high standard. People need to really ask themselves questions around unpaid internships. I think there's so many quite proven